Drew here, and it's interesting because I feel like when I went online and saw the reactions to this episode, I was kind of actually surprised to see that the main reaction to the season finale for American Gods Season 3, Tears of the Wrath-Bearing Tree, they mainly seemed to be negative. People felt a sense of frustration that this season had offered a lot of tantalizing possibilities, but it never really served up the answers that they were hoping for, which I thought was interesting. And, this might be an area where being someone who read the book has helped me because I'm not holding my breath for the answers to certain questions. I actually find it pretty amazing that some of you are holding out on spoilers as well as you have been, given that this book has been out for such a long time. Granted, it's not guaranteed that the answers in the book are the same answers in the show, but still, I would have had a very, very hard time if, let's say, Game of Thrones had all the books available and the show hadn't finished airing. I would have had a very hard time not going to the source material to find the answers to a lot of questions. So kudos to you for that. I personally thought that this episode offered a lot of answers and some very interesting hints about both where the show could go and the show's biggest mysteries. Some of them I find a little bit hard to justify. Some of them I think it's going to be interesting to see people's reactions when the whole twist is revealed. Others I feel like the Hinselman twist last episode, I feel like they've been kind of becoming so obvious that I imagine most people who haven't read the books have figured them out by now. So it's an interesting situation for sure. I personally am excited for a fourth season, and I'd give them a coin flip as to whether or not it will actually happen. I think they're clearly laying the groundwork as if it's going to happen, but given that a lot of streaming services and shows these days have actually greenlit the next season of the show pretty early in the release of the current season, I find it a little bit concerning that Starz hasn't already officially greenlit a fourth season. There have been rumors, and some of the people who are involved all but seem to say that the show has been renewed in various interviews and such, but until you hear it from Starz, nothing is official. But to me, this was a pretty good episode, but again, I knew where things were going. I knew the limitations of where the story would get to. And this whole season, I've been wondering, how far are they going to go in the book? And as a book reader, I know now at this point that they've basically covered, I would say, like 95% of the material in the book as the end of this season. And what's left is not enough to build an entire season around. So this seems very much that they're going to go in very much their own direction in season 4, and they're just going to use the book as a springboard. And I have more confidence in their ability to do that than I do in, say, Benioff and Weiss's ability to do Game of Thrones seasons 6 through 8. But, I could see there being problems with this. We'll have to wait and see. This episode, they didn't allow us to leave the season thinking that Mr. Wednesday was actually dead. I feel that the logistics of how he cheated death remain to be, they need to be explained better, let's say. But the twist that he used Shadow, that he was manipulating him to do this vigil for him so that he could have the sacrifice of a son who loves him, that will restore him to his full power. That's a pretty good twist, and I feel like a lot of people were just coming to really, really like Mr. Wednesday and then to discover what an unrepentant jerk he is and how he had taken advantage of Shadow so egregiously. I imagine that this has to be a bitter pill for many of you to swallow. I think it's interesting because in some ways it's kind of a perverse Christ story, as you have the son sacrificing himself and suffering to create more glory for the Father. And it was an interesting episode because you have this idea, I think, that the writers have been teasing out all season, that Mr. Wednesday kind of represents this individualism and this seeking of self-aggrandizement. And I think this episode, you see these two visions of Shadow that he has while he's throughout the episode. One early on in the episode before he goes to take part in Odin's vigil, and it has him jumping up on a horse to join Mr. Wednesday. And I think this is his vision of himself becoming a god and becoming like Mr. Wednesday, becoming like Odin. And as he becomes more like Odin, this episode, we see him saying a lot of things where he's talking about his own glory, his own enrichment. We hear him talking about how he can become something more, perhaps if he survives this vigil, and thinking very much of the possibility of becoming a god himself. And at the end of this episode, near the end anyway, there's this sequence where he has a vision of all these slaves, and it's the same slaves that were in the vision of the Orisha earlier in the season, and it appeared to me that he was wearing the costume of an overseer. And I think what this is showing is in that his efforts to become like Odin, he has actually identified with the oppressor. And what he has done is this emphasis on individualism, this emphasis on his own glory has taken him down this dark path. And of course, the end of this was that he got taken advantage of, and now he has on his way to the land of the dead. And what's interesting is that I think that the themes of this season that we've seen with Bilquis and the Orisha, it's showing how through the understanding that we are all part of a greater whole, that we are all part of a collective, and that we are all important to each other, that we all have a role in helping each other through hardships such as slavery, then you can see how in identifying with Odin, Shadow has become part of the oppressor, and he needs to turn from that and join with Bilquis and the other members of his community in order to become a part of this greater whole. And it'll be interesting to see how that could play out in a fourth season. So I liked the thematic heft of this episode and the way that they didn't spell it all out for us, but that the pieces were there if you were looking for them, I think, all season long. Interestingly, I thought it was funny. They didn't really want us to think that Mr. Wednesday was dead. I'm sure, people, they kind of left Shadow dead, but I think people are going to assume that Shadow will make it out, that Bilquis and Laura are going to somehow play a role in getting him back to life and bringing him out of the land of the dead. But with Mr. Wednesday, I feel that people could have actually been worried that he was dead, and I'm sure a lot of people would have rebelled at the idea of a fourth season without Ian McShane's scenery-chewing performance. He's such a larger-than-life character that just looms large in this show, and I think that thinking that he was actually gone probably could have kept some people from coming back. So they made it pretty clear that he's not gone and that he's going to have a role in the fourth season. So to me, the reveal that he was alive, that's a pretty big reveal and an interesting twist. I'm surprised that didn't tide people off better. The other big tease that is something that I can't really spoil. I could pretend, I'm theorizing, but I'm not, because I know what it is the identity of Mr. World. And I like the way that this scene played out. I feel that the revelation that Technical Boy is the bridge between the old gods and the new, and that he forgets his identity because he doesn't have his totem. This artifact that he discovers Mr. World has been hiding from him. I feel that this is an interesting twist, but it feels a little bit too similar to what they've been doing with Bilquis this season, where she's lost track of who she is because of the identity that other people have for her. And to me, it comes off as a little bit redundant in that regard. I think the show has been working overtime to make the characters that are left more important to the overall narrative. We also see this with Laura, more on that in a bit. And I feel that in some ways it comes off as a bit contrived to me personally. But I thought it was interesting, like the lines that Crispin Glover's Mr. World says here.
People say this is the age of technology. They're wrong. This is the age of manipulation. Trickery is what I do best.
I mean, come on, people. Who is he? Who do you think he is? I'm not gonna go say any more than that, but that was like a really big hint. And I'm surprised that more people hadn't already guessed this, given the way that the show has made a lot of hints at this. But regardless, I thought that this was a really interesting scene. I liked the way that both Bruce Langley and Crispin Glover acted it. I thought that they're doing a phenomenal job. Thank goodness for Crispin Glover. Not that Danny Trejo or Dominique Jackson are doing a bad job by any means, but I just really, really appreciate him in this role. I'm going to keep harping on that. But otherwise, you know, I talked about how the show has been increasing the importance of various characters. I think that, you know, it seems very much that they're making Laura the other half to Shadow. And to me, that's odd. I'm like, I don't know what the possible justification for this can be, because she doesn't really seem to have any crucial significance from the perspective of her identity. And maybe this is one of those Rey Skywalker situations where the whole point is that she doesn't have an identity, that she's just playing a role because she's playing a role, not because of who she is. I could see them trying to come up with some identity for her, but again, you know, it seems to me very much so that it would make more sense for her just to be who we know she is at this point and not for her to have some hidden identity. But it seems very much that, you know, based on the fact that Bilquis traveled to find her at the end of this episode, and that you have this imagery during one of Bilquis's visions where she's very much, you know, they show her and Shadow in this shot that where they're both, you know, clearly mirror images. I feel that it's pretty clear that, coupled with the fact that she's been hearing the, you know, the tune Requiem for Balder, it seems very much that she is the other half and that she is the one who's going to play a major role in helping Shadow to fulfill his destiny, whatever destiny that may be. And to me, you know, it's just hard to understand what the justification is. I feel like it would be silly if her whole journey of self-realization and moving away from some of the things that she's been enslaved to that have held her captive in the past is simply so that she could be Shadow's soulmate. And based on the book, I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I could see them going in a lot of more interesting and clever directions with her character than that. But at this point, you know, it just seems as though that's where they're headed with this character. So we'll have to see. I felt like, you know, a lot of people have expressed dislike for Laura and, you know, criticized the chemistry between her and Shadow. I can understand these criticisms, and I can understand disliking the character. You know, this episode, I thought she had a lot of interesting things to do. The moment where she crashes Mr. World's parlay with the old gods and, you know, reveals the truth that he was involved with Mr. Wednesday's death, basically, you know, ending negotiations, any kind of possibility of peace, and setting off a potential war. I think it seems somewhat likely to me that Mr. World knew she would crash that meeting, and we'll see, you know, what the ultimate consequences of that are going into next season. I liked the contrast between Mr. Ibis and Chernobyl this episode. I felt like, you know, you've got the one who, you know, clearly feels everything very deeply. He threatens Shadow constantly. He's angry that Shadow doesn't want to kill Laura. even though it's his responsibility as the son to avenge Odin's death. I thought, though, that it was interesting. He had the most emotional reaction to seeing Shadow suffering on the tree. So it's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out next season, if there is a next season, and how this plays into the blow that he owes Shadow with the hammer. I thought, though, the contrast with him and Mr. Ibis, who, very much here just to tell Shadow things that he needs to know, but just the calmness and the level-headed energy that Mr. Ibis brings to the proceedings. And, very, very good line deliveries. He has to give a lot of exposition, but if someone has to deliver exposition, there's one actor on this show that I would really like to hear that exposition from, because he has a very, very good delivery of these lines, and that's the actor playing Mr. Ibis. So overall, enjoyed this episode. I thought there were a lot of good teases for Season 4. On the whole, I think Season 3 didn't really, ascend to the heights of Season 1, but I would personally say I preferred it to Season 2. But what did you think? Let me know in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows, please consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, thank you for watching.